Camping, under the vast expanse of stars, can seem like the perfect way to escape the noise of everyday life. But peaceful as it seems, there's a certain vulnerability that comes with it. The thin layer of your tent, flimsy and fragile, is the only thing separating you from whatever's lurking just beyond. While nature's beauty may draw you in, it's impossible to ignore the unsettling reality. You are utterly exposed to whatever might be out there. Whether it's the whisper of the wind that sounds like footsteps, the crack of a branch in the distance, or that sense that something unseen is watching, camping holds an eerie sense of the unknown. In Japan, camping tales carry an extra chill, blending the paranormal with the all-too-real horrors of human malice. Stories of restless spirits in the forest, ancient curses and unsettling encounters with strangers who have ill intentions have haunted campers for years. Prepare yourself as we dive into these haunting camping stories you haven't heard, where the line between reality and the supernatural blurs, and the fear of what or who might be out there becomes terrifyingly real. If you enjoy these stories, make sure you subscribe to my channel. Now here's the bells. There was this summer camp aimed at elementary and middle school students. Every year we'd head out to the campsite in Iwate Prefecture. It became a sort of tradition for me. I went every summer from when I was in 2nd grade all the way up to 6th. I only started going because my cousin dragged me along in the first place. After that, I was hooked. The camp was always a highlight of my summer. Tons of activities, good food, late night pranks, and even now I think that camp is still being run. It was one of those camps where, even though it was organized, it felt like a wild adventure, especially for a kid. But my last year in 6th grade, something happened. Something that to this day, I can't really explain. It was the 2nd night of camp, and I remember feeling really tired. We'd been hiking all day, running around, climbing hills, and by the time we'd finished dinner and the campfire activities, I was absolutely exhausted. I went to bed in my tent. I was sharing my tent with my cousin, and I was out like a light. But sometime, deep in the night, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m., I suddenly woke up. I wasn't sure why. It wasn't a loud noise or someone shaking me awake, just this sudden, unexplained awareness. I sat up, blinking, trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness. The camp was completely silent, save for the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. For some reason, I felt this strong urge to get up and get out of the tent. It wasn't like I needed the bathroom or anything. I just felt like I had to go outside. So I slipped out of my sleeping bag, careful not to wake my cousin, and quietly unzipped the tent. I remember how cold the air felt against my skin when I stepped out. The moon was bright, casting this strangely bright light across the campsite, and everything seemed weirdly still. And that's when I saw someone. Someone was standing just beyond the tents in the shadows between the trees. I couldn't make out any details. It was too dark. But I could tell that it was a person. They didn't move. They didn't say a word. They just stood there. But there was something about them. It's hard to explain. But I felt like they were waiting for me, like they wanted me to follow. Without really thinking, I started walking towards them. I didn't feel scared, even though I knew deep down that this was probably a very bad idea. There was this pull, like I had no choice but to follow them. I just really wanted to be over there. I don't really know how to contextualize or verbalize the feeling I had at the time. The camp had this strict rule, never leave the campsite at night. But at that moment, I didn't care. I was focused entirely on that figure, standing by the edge of the tree line. They turned and began walking away, heading towards the camp's exit. I followed them without hesitation. They were about 20 meters ahead of me. Always just far enough that I couldn't see their face or any features, but from their size and the way they moved, I was sure they were an adult, a tall one at that. We kept walking, me quietly trailing behind, and before I knew it, we were nearing the edge of the campsite. The exit was just up ahead, a small opening in the trees that led to the main road. The figure was almost there, and I was right behind them. But then, out of nowhere, I felt this strong grip on my arm. I jumped almost like I was jolted awake from a dream. My heart was pounding in my chest as I whipped around. It was my cousin, breathless, his pale face covered in sweat. He was gripping my arm so hard that it hurt. "What the hell are you doing?" he half yelled, half whispered, clearly trying not to wake the entire camp. "Why are you leaving the campsite?" I was stunned, completely confused. I hadn't even realized I was about to cross the boundary. My cousin told me that he'd woken up when he noticed that I was gone, and had run out of the tent to catch me. He had been calling my name, he said, chasing after me the whole way, but I hadn't heard a single word. Not his voice, not his rush of footsteps, nothing. And even though he was running at full speed, it seemed to take him forever to catch up to me. I glanced in the direction of the person I had been following. They were still there, still walking. They hadn't even acknowledged me or my cousin. They just continued on their way, disappearing into the shadows beyond the campsite's exit. It was like they didn't care that I had stopped following them. The next morning I sat down with my cousin to talk about what had happened. He was freaked out, like genuinely scared. I could tell he didn't want to admit it, but something about the whole situation had really shaken him. I'm honestly not sure if he thought I was a little crazy or disturbed or something, because he swore he hadn't seen anyone else out there. No shadowy figure leading me away, nothing. To him, it just looked like I was sleepwalking, heading straight for the road by myself. He couldn't understand how I hadn't heard him shouting, or how I had managed to keep walking so calmly when he was sprinting full tilt to stop me. The whole thing freaked him out, so much so that for the rest of the camp, he stayed glued to me at night. Normally he was one of the ones leading the pranks, sneaking into other campers' tents, drawing on their faces with markers while they slept. It was a tradition, one he usually loved, but not this time. On the last night of camp, he was the first to bed, zipping himself up into his sleeping bag like he wanted to block out the world. He even made me promise that I wouldn't leave the tent for anything, no matter what. I could tell he was serious, so I stayed put. The rest of the night passed by without any more strange incidents, but by the time we were packing up to go home, I had almost forgotten about that night. Well, maybe forced it to the back of my mind due to the embarrassment, might be a bit more accurate to say, but my cousin, he hadn't. Even on the bus ride home, he kept glancing over at me, like he was still worried something weird might happen. Looking back now, it's strange, but I wasn't really scared when it all happened. It just felt odd. But when I think about it now, about what might have happened if my cousin hadn't stopped me from leaving the campsite, that's when the chills set in. Where would I have gone? Who was that person? What would have happened if I had followed them all the way out? I'll probably never know. I've only had 2 strange, unexplainable experiences in my life, and that was one of them. Even though it wasn't outright terrifying, it's the kind of thing that sticks with you, lurking in the back of your mind. Sometimes I wish I could go back to those summers, back to the camp where we hiked, laughed, and pulled pranks under the stars, but that one night, it's a reminder that there's a lot out there we just don't understand. This is a story from a friend of mine who used to work as a systems engineer. He's allowed me to share it. I think this will chime with certain people, so I'm putting it out there. He was stuck in a brutally demanding work environment, where working overtime for 4 or 5 hours a day had become part of his routine. On top of that, he barely managed to get 3 hours of sleep a night. By the time he turned 30, his life resembled that of a university student studying for a national entrance exam, a continuous grind with no rest. Eventually, the inevitable happened. He collapsed, his body unable to handle the stress anymore. Diagnosed with nervous gastritis, he was also told he had mild depression. His company, probably realizing how much they had pushed him, gave him a generous 5-day vacation and a nice bonus, likely in an attempt to make up for it. But by then the damage had already been done. He had already started to fall deeper into real depression. For anyone who's had depression, you'll understand, sadness just isn't a fleeting feeling you can shake off with a change of scenery or a workout. Depression is a real neurological condition. It's like the brain's happiness switch is malfunctioning, and the circuits for anxiety and sadness are firing on all cylinders. Even comedy, which is supposed to make you laugh, can make you feel deeply sad. It's like no matter what you do, the gloomy parts of life stand out in sharper detail, overshadowing everything else. So while he technically had time off, the mere thought of returning to the same toxic work environment filled him with fear. Sometimes the word suicide would drift across his mind like an unwelcome guest. And before he knew it, he found himself getting into his trusty Suzuki Jimny, his companion on many road trips, and heading to a mountain near his hometown, a place that held memories from his youth, about 3 hours away. In high school, he had been in the mountaineering club, and he had climbed that mountain countless times. It was a familiar place. He packed lightly, a tent, sleeping bags, some food and water, and he set off at dusk. There wasn't a plan, really. He just walked, placing one foot in front of the other, as if the act of moving forward would somehow help him leave behind the crushing weight of his thoughts. As he climbed higher, the air grew crisper and cooler. The smell of grass, trees, water, and earth filled his lungs, and the sweat running down his back gave him a sense of physicality that felt grounding after being so disconnected for so long. It was a sensation that he hadn't experienced in years, one that reminded him of a time when things were simpler. After walking for hours, he came across an open space with a water source. Though it wasn't the one usual spot he used to camp at, he thought it was going to be good enough. Since it was off-season, there was no one else around. The solitude suited him. He set his tent up, laid his sheet down, and unpacked his things. He boiled some water and cooked some ramen, eating it alongside a rice ball, and washed it down with tea. He sat there in the quiet without realizing it. The solitude of the mountain air was starting to wash away his heavy feelings, and even the insomnia that had been plaguing him began to ease. He felt sleepy. After putting out the campfire, he climbed into his sleeping bag. He fell into a deep sleep almost instantly, not even sure his head had touched the pillow. Suddenly he was pulled from sleep by a voice. "Did you come here to die?" "Huh?" He blinked, groggy and confused. "Hey, did you come here to die?" The voice was clear now. His heavy eyelids opened, and to his surprise he saw a small figure peering inside his tent. It wasn't fear that filled him though. It was more like curiosity. He wriggled out of his sleeping bag, put on his glasses, and turned on the lantern. And that's when he saw her, a little girl about 10 years old, dressed in a beautiful red kimono. Her hair was neatly cut to her shoulders, and she was shielding her eyes from the light with her hand. But she didn't look scared at all. She just stared at him, calm and direct. Still groggy and confused, he tried to make sense of what was happening. The girl tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful, as she spoke again. "Did you come here to die?" He finally understood the question, and without fully realizing it, he answered her. "I don't know. I think I was just really tired, but right now, no. I'm not thinking about dying." At his response, the girl in the red kimono smiled, her white teeth flashing in the dim light. "That's good." Out of habit, he tore open a pack of candy that he brought with him for energy, even though it wasn't really necessary for this climb. He handed one to the girl, who looked at it with curiosity. "It's candy," he explained, unwrapping one and popping it into his mouth. He showed her how to eat it, and she followed suit, her face lighting up with a smile as she tasted it. She stepped into his tent and said, "Sing." "What?" "Sing me a song," she insisted, her voice soft and persistent. It took him a moment to understand that she wanted a lullaby. Panicking a little, he realized that he didn't know what to sing. But somehow, without thinking, he found himself gently rocking her back and forth and softly singing a tune from his childhood. "Are Mum and Dad doing well? Are my friends okay? Whenever it rains or the wind blows, I think of my hometown." He often thought of his parents who he hadn't called since New Year's. He thought of his elementary school that he graduated from, the candy shop in the park where he'd played as a kid. "I'll fulfill my dreams, and someday I'll return. The mountains are green in my hometown, and the water is clear in my hometown." Before he knew it, tears were streaming down his face. He hadn't cried in months, maybe even years, but now, all the emotions he had buried inside himself came pouring out. As he sobbed, the girl didn't say anything. She just wrapped her small arms around him and gently rocked back and forth. And then he woke up. The morning sunlight was streaming into his tent through the opening. His face was still wet with tears, but something inside him had changed. He felt lighter, freer. It was as if a weight had been lifted off of his shoulders. He glanced around the tent and there were candy wrappers neatly placed in a pile, but there was no sign of the girl. Of course there wasn't. He just assumed he had had an incredibly realistic dream. He washed his face with cold water, packed up his things, and headed down the mountain, feeling more refreshed than he had in months. Back at work, things changed too. His colleagues had finally pushed for better conditions, and now he was often able to leave on time. He felt like he had a second chance at life. He remains deeply grateful for that strange encounter on the mountain, but he admits there's one thing that still lingers in his mind. "I often find myself thinking about that girl," he says. "I wonder who she really was." Maybe she was a product of his stressed out mind, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. Or maybe she was something more, something that didn't want him to die on that mountain or anywhere else. Whatever the case is, he's gone back to that spot a few times, but he's never seen the girl in the red kimono again. Still, each time when he visits, he leaves an unwrapped candy behind, just in case. And each time he feels at peace, knowing that he's not alone in the world. In the end, he didn't just survive that night of camping on the mountain. He came back to life. So here's a really weird and creepy story a friend of mine told me. It happened when he was camping with his high school friends. You know, one of those school trips for team bonding or something. I never went on one, but after hearing this, I'm glad that I didn't. It was the middle of the night when things got seriously strange. Out of nowhere, this eerie but oddly beautiful melody started echoing through the campsite. You ever hear something that feels off, like it just doesn't belong? That's what this was like. Everyone in the camp woke up, confused, groggy, and instantly unsettled. They started poking their heads out of the tents. trying to figure out what the hell that sound was and where it was coming from. And that's when they saw it. Right in the middle of their campsite was a box, just sitting there. It was pretty big and filthy, like it had been dragged through the dirt and left out to rot. No one had a clue where it came from, but it was clear that was what was making the noise. It was a music box, an old one. The top was open, and on the inside of the lid, there was this black and white photo of a little girl. She looked like she might have been 7 or 8, smiling shyly, like she was posing for some old portrait. The strange thing was, she was clearly foreign, white, maybe European, which was odd enough in a rural part of Japan. But what really got them was the fact that no one recognized her face. Not one of them had seen her photo before. I mean, there's no real reason why they should recognize her, but I guess it could have been an actress or something. Naturally, everyone started asking the obvious question, who put this thing here? They all looked around, but nobody in the group had any idea where the music box had come from. It wasn't a prank, they were sure of that. No one in the club would have gone to that much trouble. The thing was old and creepy, not exactly something you'd go out of your way to carry around. Plus, how would you hide it from the others? After a while, the tension started building. They didn't want to leave that thing in the middle of the camp, but no one really wanted to touch it either. So they did what every group of teenagers would do. They made the youngest guy, some poor first year, take it away. It wasn't fair, but that's how it went. He was the lowest ranked member of the group, so they sent him out into the woods with the box. The kid didn't argue, he just picked it up and carried it into the trees, and disappeared for a bit. And when he came back, they all felt a little better. He might have gone up a few social points after that. The music had stopped, and the box was gone, and for a moment, they thought it was over. But even with the quiet, my friend said there was still this heaviness in the air, like the forest around them was holding its breath, waiting for something. None of them could really get back to sleep. It wasn't just the weirdness of the music box, it was something else, the feeling that something was watching them. My friend said it was hard to explain, but you know that sensation when someone's eyes are on you, even though you can't see them? That's what it felt like. They tried to brush it off, but no one really did much sleeping after that. Then, about an hour later, they heard it again. That same haunting melody started drifting back into the campsite. The same eerie notes rising and falling, filling the night air. At first they thought maybe they were hearing things. No one had left the tent, and they hadn't seen or even heard anyone outside. Somehow the music box was back there. The fear hit them hard. Everyone started whispering to their tent partners, trying to figure out what was going on, but no one was brave enough to step outside and check. They had no idea where that kid had taken the box, but somehow it had found its way back into the middle of the camp. And that's when the captain of the club, trying to keep it together, opened his tent a crack and yelled out, "Don't touch it! Just leave it alone, we'll deal with it in the morning." Easier said than done, right? They tried to ignore it, but the tension was unbearable. My friend said they all just lay there, no doubt holding their collective breath, waiting for the music to stop. They could hear the winding mechanism inside the music box slowing down, for the notes dragging out longer and longer until finally, it seemed like the music box was dying out for good. And then for a split second, they felt relieved the music had stopped. And maybe now they could actually sleep. But just when they started to relax, they heard it. Click, click, click. Someone was winding the music box back up. Panic set in. None of them dared move. No one wanted to look outside to see who or what was winding that box up, but they all knew it wasn't one of them. They hadn't heard anyone leave their tents. The music started again, slowly at first, but it built up, becoming clearer and louder. Whoever was out there wasn't just playing the music. They were toying with them. My friend swore it sounded like the winding up was happening right outside their tents. like someone was deliberately staying close, just out of sight. And it didn't stop. All night long the winding sound would pause and then start again, like someone was sitting out there in the woods, taking their time, messing with them. My friend said at one point he could have sworn he heard footsteps, light and deliberate. Not a deer, not an animal, but footsteps. When he sat up to try and catch a glimpse of whoever was doing it, the footsteps stopped. They were all probably praying for the dawn to come. Finally, just before sunrise, the music stopped. The winding sound was gone. It felt like the whole forest exhaled at once, as whatever was out there had finished playing its little game. When the sun started to rise, they cautiously crawled out of their tents, scared of what they might find, but the music box, it was gone. Vanished, just like that. They looked around, but there was no sign of it anywhere, just an empty patch of ground where it had been playing all night. No tracks, no disturbed earth, nothing. Everyone was pale, exhausted, they hadn't slept a wink, and no one knew what to make of it. One of the guys muttered, "Maybe it just wanted us to hear the music. Maybe it just wanted us to hear the music." And my friend, he said for some reason that explanation made sense to him, like it wasn't out there to hurt them, just to show them something. But he also admitted something else. There was this creeping thought in the back of his mind that maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there, some stranger hiding in the woods watching them the whole time. Personally, I'm not so sure about the whole "it wanted us to hear the music" theory. I mean, a lot of weirdos hang out in the woods, right? I wouldn't be surprised if there was some guy out there winding a box all night just to mess with them. It takes a special kind of creep to sit there winding up a music box up all night though. Maybe he was waiting for one of them to get curious and come out. Whatever the truth is, that story still gives me the chills. This is a really weird and creepy story that one of my hiking buddies told me. It happened when he was camping with his club in the mountains. You always hear strange things happen in the mountains, but this one? It's really something else. So it was nighttime, and the group was just getting ready to crash out for the night. They'd started putting out the campfire and doing their usual before bed stuff when they heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps coming from below the mountain trail. Out of the darkness, this guy appeared. He looked totally normal at first glance, but then it hit them. He was wearing a navy blue suit. Not exactly what you'd expect to see out in the middle of the woods. And on top of that, he had a briefcase, polished leather shoes, and his hair slicked back in this perfect comb-over. The guy smiled at them, showing all his teeth, and then he asked, super casually, "Excuse me, have you seen a man who looks just like me?" Everyone just kind of stared at him, not really sure if they'd heard him right. Like, what? Who asks that? Just imagine being asked that in the woods while you're out camping by a guy in a suit. It's weird. My friend was the first to pipe up. He said, no, we haven't seen anyone really." The tone he answered the man in the suit's question was a very confused one. You know that inflection kind of thing where you're subtly hinting that something is awkward or strange. The man then gave them a polite little bow, thanked them, and then just started hiking up the trail again, towards the mountain peak. The weirdest part? He was fast. Like, really fast. My buddy said that even though they were all pretty experienced hikers, this guy's speed was impressive. They all just stood there watching him disappear into the night. "What the hell was that about?" someone finally asked. But no one had an answer, of course. After a few moments of awkward silence, they shrugged it off and went back to getting ready to turn in for the night. About 10 minutes passed, and then they heard footsteps again. It was the same heavy, deliberate sound of someone coming up the trail. This time, they were all on edge, watching the path with a kind of dread, and sure enough, the guy in the suit appeared again. Well, it looked like the same guy, in the same suit, with the same briefcase, but they just watched him go up. Without missing a beat, he smiled when their torchlight fell on him and asked the same exact question. "Excuse me, have you seen a man who looks just like me?" My pal quickly answered this time, "Yeah, you literally just walked past us, man." The guy's face lit up, like he was genuinely relieved. "Ah, thank you so much." And with that, he hurried up the trail, just like before. At this point, they're all freaking out. No one can make sense of it, but it didn't end there. Oh no. A third time, they hear footsteps coming up the hill. One of the guys whispers, "No way." And there he was again. The same man, the same suit, the same smile, asking the same damn question. "Excuse me, have you seen a man who looks just like me?" And they give him the same answer, and off he goes again, heading for the top of the mountain. By this point, no one was in the mood to sleep anymore. They were just packing up their gear, trying to decide if they should just leave. But then it happened again. And again. 5 times. This guy, or these guys who looked exactly the same, showed up and asked the same creepy question, and then walked up the mountain like it was the most normal thing in the world. 5 identical conversations, 5 identical men, all acting like it was totally fine. By the 5th time, they were all so freaked out that my friend, who had sort of adapted into the kind of leader role at that point, finally said, "Screw this, we're moving camp." They packed everything up as fast as they could and hiked to another spot, far away from the trail. They didn't see that guy again after that, and the rest of the night passed in an uneasy, restless silence. Personally, I would have gone home, but to each their own. To this day, my buddy still doesn't know what was going on. Was it 5 different guys? Some weird cult or something? Or just one guy somehow looping back round through the woods to ask them the same question over and over again? But for what reason? Either way, it scared them. And honestly, the idea of running into someone like that in the mountains, I think that's just as terrifying as any paranormal encounter to me. Men in suits who look identical with briefcases, or one mad man circling back round again and again. That's too weird for me. So this is a story a classmate once told me about something weird and unsettling that happened to him. He had gone hiking in the mountains alone during the summer, and it turned into an experience that really freaked him out. Why he would want to do solo camping in the mountains is beyond me, but I guess that was just something he enjoyed doing. He set up a small tent for the night after a long day of hiking. It was one of those quiet, isolated spots in the middle of nowhere. Exhausted, he was out almost immediately and slept like a rock. But sometime deep into the night, he started to hear a voice calling out to him from a distance. It was muffled, like someone shouting through a wall or something. "Hey," the voice said. At first, he was still half asleep and groggy, so he just mumbled back, "What the hell?" And that's when the ground underneath him suddenly shifted. He jolted fully awake, heart racing, and quickly looked around the tent. Nothing seemed off there. It wasn't an earthquake and the trees outside were still. Everything was calm, except for his heart pounding in his chest. The voice came again. "Hey," it called in the same muffled tone, almost like it was coming from underground. He sat there in his tent, trying to shake off the sleep and figure out what was happening. "Who's there?" he called back, sticking his head out of the tent to see if anyone was nearby. The ground under his tent trembled again, just enough to send a chill down his spine. But it wasn't an earthquake. Nothing around him moved. He stuck his head out of the tent again and noted that there was no wind, no swaying branches, nothing. It was like the earth itself was shifting, but only right under his tent. That's when he started to panic. He ducked back into his sleeping bag, zipped it up tight, and just lay there, listening. The voice kept calling out, "Hey!" But now, he was sure of it. It was coming from below the ground. He said he thought that it was like someone was buried beneath him, trying to get his attention. He said it felt like the earth was alive, moving beneath him, in a way that just didn't make any sense. He tried to stay calm, but every instinct was screaming at him to just ignore it, to not engage. Then he made up his mind. He wasn't going to answer anymore. No way. He forced himself to close his eyes, curl up in his sleeping bag, and try to get back to sleep. And it wasn't easy, because that voice was still calling from below, and the occasional tremor made his tent shudder. But eventually, he dozed off. The next morning, though, things got even weirder. When he unzipped the front of his tent to get out, a pile of black dirt tumbled inside. Confused, he crawled out, and that was when he noticed something strange. His entire tent had sunk about a foot into the ground. It was like the earth had softened and swallowed it while he slept. Even weirder, the soil around his tent was freshly disturbed, like someone or something had dug around it during the night. But he was sure he set it up on solid ground the day before. The whole area felt off, like it had been tampered with. The dirt was loose and soft, and it definitely wasn't like that when he pitched his tent. He swears by that. His mind raced to try and figure out what had happened. Could there really have been someone beneath the earth? Or maybe someone had hidden a speaker underground somewhere to play tricks on him. He looked around. He couldn't shake the strange idea that if he had kept answering that voice, he might have been dragged down into the earth underground with it. Man, if I kept responding, I could have been pulled underground for good, he told me later, his voice shaky, even as he tried to laugh it off. I just found the whole thought process so absurd. I can't really imagine what brought him to feel so strongly about it. But it was like he was certain. He swears he wasn't imagining it, and honestly I believe him. The idea of being alone in the mountains with something trying to pull you into the earth, yeah, that would scare anyone. After that, he packed up all his things as quickly as he could, and he continued with his hike. He finished his route as planned, but nothing else weird happened on the rest of the trip. Was I really scared? He asked himself when I pressed him about it. Hell yeah, I was. I was all alone out there. But after that, I just pushed through and finished the hike. No more weird stuff after that. Even though he tried to play it off, I could tell that experience messed with him. Honestly, I think he was lucky. Whether it was some strange natural occurrence or something more supernatural, it really scared him, and honestly it creeped me out, just hearing about it. So you won't catch me camping alone in the woods. So here's a story that my dad told me about something really strange he experienced. He might have seen a ghost, or at least that's what he believes. When I was little, our extended family decided to go on a road trip together. About 15 of us in total. We rented a bus and we hit the road. It was one of those big family outings that are chaotic but fun. I don't remember much since I was a kid, but this story has been told many times at so many family gatherings that it's like a legend now. We reached our destination, which was this big, beautiful lake surrounded by the mountains. The plan was to set up the tents near the lake and have a massive barbecue. The weather was perfect, at first. Everyone was in high spirits. The adults were grilling, the kids were playing by the water. It was a great time. But then out of nowhere, the sky turned dark. Thick clouds rolled in, and before we knew it, it started pouring. Like, really pouring. It was one of those sudden storms where the rain was so heavy you could barely see a few feet ahead. Our tents didn't stand a chance. Water started seeping in, and it was clear we weren't going to be sleeping in them that night. So we all piled back into the bus to stay dry. The adults weren't ready to call it a night though. They set up an impromptu party at the front of the bus, cracking open beers and passing around snacks. As the night went on, most people started to drift off to sleep in their seats. Eventually, only my dad and my uncle were left awake, still chatting, having a few drinks. It was well past midnight when they heard this faint tapping sound coming from outside the bus. At first they thought it was just the rain or maybe something like a branch hitting the side of the bus, but the tapping was consistent. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone was knocking. Curious and a bit unnerved, my dad got up and peeked through the window. What he saw gave him the chills. Standing outside in the torrential rain was a young woman, wearing a raincoat. She didn't have an umbrella, and she was completely soaked. Her hair was dripping wet, and she was just standing there, staring at the bus. My dad and my uncle exchanged glances. "What the hell is this woman doing here at this hour?" my uncle whispered. They were deep in the mountains, miles away from main roads. There were no houses nearby, no other campers. Nothing. It just didn't make any sense. Feeling a mix of concern and unease, my dad cracked open the window a little and called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman just looked up at him with a blank expression. "I can't come inside. So, please can you come out here?" My uncle frowned. "It's pouring rain. Why don't you just come inside? We can give you a towel or something warm to drink maybe." She shook her head slowly. "I can't come inside. Please come out." Something about her tone and her insistence was unsettling. She didn't seem cold or bothered by the rain at all. My dad felt a knot forming in his stomach. "Look, if you need an umbrella or a towel, we'll give it to you. But we're not going out there in this weather." The woman just stared at them for a moment longer, then turned around and walked away into the darkness. My dad and my uncle sat back down, both a bit shaken, returning to their drinks. "That was weird," my uncle said. "Why was she so adamant about us going outside?" Then it dawned on him. They were miles away from any civilization, in the middle of the nowhere during a storm, and a soaking wet woman shows up and asks them to come outside? Just didn't make any sense. "Do you think..." I know this is going to sound weird, but she was something not quite human, my dad said. Neither of them wanted to say it out loud, but the possibility hung heavy in the air. They decided not to dwell on it and tried to get some sleep, though neither slept well that night. The next morning they told everyone about what had happened. Of course the rest of the family laughed it off, teasing them about drinking too much and imagining things, but my dad and my uncle knew what they saw. A few weeks later they heard a local legend from someone familiar with the area. According to the story, a young woman who had once eloped with her lover, but for some tragic reason, some say she was jilted or something, she ended up throwing herself into the lake. Since then, people have reported seeing a woman in a raincoat near the lake during the storms, asking people to come outside. The description matched the woman my dad and my uncle had seen. Over the years, this incident became a staple story at our family gatherings. Each time it's told, it gets a bit more embellished, but my dad and my uncle always insist on the core details. They say that the woman looked entirely real, nothing ghostly about her appearance. She had feet, she cast a shadow, her voice sounded normal. That's what made it feel even creepier. But maybe people who die with unresolved feelings don't even realize they're gone, my dad mused once. Maybe they just wander around, blending into our world, trying to interact with the living. As a kid, hearing him say that sent shivers down my spine. I often wonder what would have happened if they decided to go outside that night. I know people talk about paranormal experiences in the mountain, and maybe there's some truth to it. But honestly, the idea of encountering someone or something like that really freaks me out. Whether it was a ghost or a person with bad intentions, it's equally terrifying. Either way, that story still gives me the creeps.